Right, looks like we're underway. Well, welcome to this Zoom Cafe Scientifique. We hope sometime in the not so distant future to get back in the New Headley Club where we have our meet space meetings. That's a term I got for my son about actually when human beings actually get together. Rather a grim term, but we're carrying on for, well, I don't know, at least to the probably the end of the summer, and then we'll start hopefully sort of live events. But anyway, on with the show. It's a great pleasure, a particularly great pleasure to invite or have along tonight John Sadler, professor at Birmingham University. Pretty nice because John and I have worked on some stuff together, and he's going to talk to us about well, the title is A Walk on the Wild Side, and basically about the effects of urbanization on wildlife and nature. So was that about right, John? So over to you, John. Unmute yourself.
Righto, I'm unmuting. That was perfect. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'll share my screen in a sec, and we'll get going. I'm happy to be here. It's I'd much rather be there drinking a pint with you all, but it is what it is in the current world. Do with what we can. I will probably make loads of errors as I do this, even though I've been teaching virtually since the first lockdown, so I should be an expert, but I still manage to knock mutes on and flip off screen shares and whatever as we move along. So that I apologize. I'll share my screen and we'll get cracking. I pruned a lot out of this talk, having spoken to Paul on Saturday evening. It's when I've done it again. See, I'm muting myself there just to make it obvious that I do make errors. So I've taken a fair bit out, but I'm hoping there's a kind of common narrative and thread that I can develop with you. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, so I've been spent probably the last 10 to 15 years, if not a bit longer, looking at how urbanization as a process influences biodiversity and the outcomes for plants and animals. And in a way, I kind of got a couple of quotes to kick off. There's a really interesting there's a brilliant book by a chap called Robert Pyle, who is an ecologist who works in this area, called The Thunder Tree. And in that, he says, I believe one of the greatest causes of the ecological crisis is the state of personal alienation from nature that many people live by. And he dubs that process something called extinction of experience. And what he's doing is he's simply saying that when things disappear from our local neighborhood, plants and animal species disappear from our local neighborhood, it endangers our experience and interaction with them. And I thought that was it's a really interesting book, this, and it kind of captures part of the reason that I'm so interested in wildlife in cityscapes. And the other reason is related to something that Tim Beatley wrote, the professor in the States. He's the architect of the Biophilic Cities Network, which you can check out on Google if you want to understand what it is. And he says, part of the pleasure of living in the city is discovering that many forms of nature exist in unexpected places. Some of it's designed, but much of it is simply extant. It's there, and it resiliently co-adapts to urban conditions. And this is the thing that captures me, because it's the thing that I kind of think about as I move to and fro in my city, cycling down a canal path, and I know where the birds are going to be singing. I know where the little orchids are going to pop up on the canal path. He says over the course of a day, there are numerous opportunities to be surprised by the nature around us as it appears and disappears from view, a bird, a mushroom, a flower. And it appears again, sorry about that. I'm not actually touching anything. It keeps muting me. He says this flips and changes depending on weather, season, and the pathways that we choose to move around. And some of this discovery is surprising and can give us kind of really important moments of delight, which makes part of living in a biophilic city in terms of so much fun. So these two kind of quotes kind of get at the heart of urban ecology and the narratives that surround urban ecology in terms of how people view urbanization as a force that homogenizes ecological communities. So if you're a gardener, for example, or a botanist, if you trip around global cities, you will recognize weedy species that are common to UK cities. And that's part of this idea that urbanization somehow reduces and homogenizes species, assemblages and pools. The flip side of that, of course, is that people like me that study tiny little insects and strange little organisms that are hard to monitor and sample, we find really rare and interesting stuff right in the heart of cityscapes. So we've got these two contending narratives. We've got, it causes homogeneity, and I've got a narrative that says, actually, there's boatloads out there in your local spaces that's worth studying and worth looking at. And some of this stuff is not just unusual, but it's incredibly rare. So I've spent the last few years, quite a number of years, studying this. So what I'm going to do to you today is to kind of walk through this idea of the link between how a city is structured and the outcomes that that structure has in terms of the biodiversity, the assembly of biodiversity into communities and assemblages, but also the way that biodiversity actually functions to generate some kind of ecological function that helps us provide some kind of ecological services. So I'm going to take a very narrow view on this. I'm going to focus my attention on things that are not particularly well known. And I'm going to cover a lot of stuff that's well known really quickly just to give you a background. And I'm going to focus down on movement, animal movement and connectivity in systems, and the way that what we do in cities in terms of generating sound pollution and indeed artificial light pollution can impact that core ecological function. Because movement between populations is the kind of bedrock to overall maintenance of populations within a cityscape. So I'm going to relate to you a lot of work done by very, very many researchers, which I've had the pleasure to help train and work with, much cleverer than I am, a lot younger, have set off and generated academic careers in their own right. And over the last 10 years, 15 years, we've studied effectively Birmingham in very great detail. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that kind of activity. Now, one of the joys of approaching retirement is you get to work with lots of smart young people who are actually quite a bit smarter than me. One of the terrible things about creeping up the academic ladder is you don't get to do any of the interesting stuff yourself. You get to manage a lot of stuff, but you don't actually get to do it. So I'm going to talk to you now about our studies in Birmingham. This plot up here, which is a kind of map of Birmingham, it's broken into different colours. And those different colours indicate the level of green and grey in 1 kilometre squares right the way across the conurbation. The black country isn't in this map. So this is Birmingham City extending down here to the southeast into Solihull. And that blob right on the east there is Coventry. And these little dots in the cityscape sat in these 1 km squares are survey sites for a range of different animals, bird species, bat species, moth species, solitary bees, and indeed epigeal groups such as ground beetles, which is Cycrus coroboides, sat there on some moss. And what we've done is we've utilized remote sensing data from satellites. We've utilized aerial photography data at 20 centimeter resolution and a range of other remote sensing products to kind of generate metrics to try and understand how the landscape is structured. And we used OS data on a range of different things. And we've used those at a 1 km square, and we've effectively classified the conurbation. So the red here is quite highly urban. The green here is very green. And you can see that the Solihull, for example, is a very green place adjacent to Birmingham. And this is the green patch at the top, which if you know anything about the West Midlands is Sutton Park, which is a national nature reserve. And it's an area of heathland. It's very green. And you can see the green fringes around the network of the cityscape, and then this kind of green, bright red core, which is highly urbanized space within the city. So we've been out there and we've sampled a whole range of stuff. And what we're trying to do is understand the relationship between the form of the landscape and the outcome for biodiversity. And I'm going to just review the key patterns, and I'm going to use that as a shoehorn to focus in on some ecological services and some core ecological functions that sustain animal populations. So let's get cracking. So our finding, looking at a whole range of different taxa, ranging from basal trophic levels, plant species, right the way up to secondary and tertiary producers, so bird species that feed on insects undertake herbivory and feed on plant species. So a nice kind of trophic pyramid. And what we've confirmed is stuff that we probably isn't too surprising. We confirm that there is indeed a generalized reduction in species richness as landscapes urbanize. And that cuts across pretty much all taxa groups. Fewer bird species, fewer bat species, fewer beetle species, fewer moth species, etc., etc. We've also observed that as you look at an assemblage, the assemblage becomes uneven as urbanization increases. So you get communities and assemblages that certain species dominate. So you get a very uneven balance. You get a few generalist species that are really common, and then you get a fewer run of rarer species that are not common. So it becomes very unbalanced. And in natural environments, our assemblages tend to be quite even, so that the distribution of the number of organisms, the number of individuals against the species is quite balanced. As urbanization proceeds, then some species are filtered out. And what's happening is that down that kind of gradient from kind of green rural idyll to kind of urban grey post-industrial spaces, species are being removed. So you're getting a sequence where some species, which are generally generalists that can tolerate high levels of disturbance and got wide habitat tolerances, become super abundant, and we lose species that have got extremely specific habitat associations, for example, woodland species. So thinking about the beetles, we lose some of our larger woodland beetle species, just get excluded from the system. And we also lose species with particular traits. So species that are poor dispersers, species that are large bodied, get removed from the species pools. So this kind of modification of the land use and land cover in cities impacts the biodiversity. It removes and changes the communities that are associated with our survey sites. Now that's important because it means that we've got variability in biodiversity across our cityscape, so we've got less chance of seeing rare stuff in certain places, and more chance of seeing common weedy stuff and all that kind of thing. But also it influences the ecological functions that can take place in those particular places. So things like nutrient decomposition, things like how vegetation can absorb pollutants, can cool skies. Transpiration from plants is known to cool and reduce urban heat islands. So we end up with this kind of knock-on where the variability in the assemblage pools has an impact in the sorts of services that can be provided. So it's not all great news. So I'm going to visualize this now and model it in terms of a kind of notional idea about how urban systems function in relation to those things: the assembly of biodiversity, the types of communities, the ecological functions they provide, and ultimately the ecological services that fall out of that ecological function provision. So I've generated this little kind of model here, and if you can imagine staring at Leeds from a satellite, and you look down, you can do it in Google Maps. You don't need to risk going up in a satellite. You can do it on Google Maps. Look down, look at the way that Leeds is constructed, much in the same way as I did with Birmingham with my remote sensing data and GIS data. And you can see a kind of loose structure within the system. And that loose structure is the form or composition of the landscape. And in it, you're going to see visible chunks of habitat that would be recognizable, gardens, for example, large woodland patches, maybe big ponds. And between it, you're going to see kind of scrubby areas and derelict areas, variable landscape. And what we're looking at is a kind of patch matrix linkage or corridor type model, which derives very directly from landscape ecology theory that was developed in the 50s and 60s. Now, the way that that thing's organized and the way that those patches are kind of assembled in the landscape and the way that they're linked together by features relates to the linkage and connectivity, which is an ecological function in its own right. So the way it's organized, the way that the landscape is organized, can either impede or enhance movement of organisms between populations. And that's very important for the overall stability of individual populations of plants and animals. But these biodiversity assembled into these kind of chunks of habitat also do other things. They provide ecological functions or ecosystem functions that do things that generate service outcomes. So, for example, they generate decomposition, they provide capacity for fluid storage, and then the outcome of that is enhanced nutrient cycling, where we've got enhanced decompositional rates, but also enhanced fluid storage, where we have got greener environments that can absorb runoff, for example. So this organization, this spatial organization, leads to some kind of service output. So because it's an urban area, we're directly interfacing with people all the time. So it's kind of viewed in the literature as some kind of urban social ecological system where the things that I'm interested in, species diversity, habitats, populations, biomass, linked to processes such as movement, nutrient cycling, productivity, pollination, competition, that kind of stuff, and generate higher level functions in terms of retention of biomass, the capacity for self-renewal, and adaptive capacities. And it's all linked to how we've organized our landscape as humans in terms of generating that, if you like, visual top-down map. And of course, we utilize cities for other things. You know, we live in them, we do things in them, we make noise in them, we light them up so that we can have a 24-hour city and all that kind of stuff. So what I've just zoomed through there is kind of like 30 or 40 years worth of, this is how the patch network looks in terms of biodiversity. Where are the emerging knowledge gaps? And the things I want to focus my attention on today, just to kind of fill out and make it linked much more directly to function and service provision, are three things: connectivity, the linkage between patches in landscapes, in cityscapes, and then the synergistic influence of things that we do in cities, the way we manage light infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit about artificial light at night. If you want to get the bee's knees, know everything there is to do about light, again, go and see Kevin Gaston's lab down in Exeter, because his core focus at the moment has been on the ecology of artificial light. Fantastic colleague, brilliant academic. If you want to know the other element that's emerging now is an interest in soundscapes. And in a strange way, this has kind of fallen out of COVID and the fact that we've all been in lockdown, have been kind of re-tuning ourselves back into our own local spaces. And we've noticed that, you know, traffic noise has decreased and suddenly everybody's hearing more birds, right? So this idea of acoustic ecology and soundscape ecology is a kind of emerging field, headed up really nicely by Professor Kate Jones down at UCL. If you want to learn a little bit more, go and have a look at some of her work. She's a specialist on bats. So I'm going to kind of focus on those three things and try and look at the links between the form of the cityscape, some of the work that we've done, and the outcomes that our infrastructure management and the way that we do things in cities might influence that biology. So just to kick us off, I displayed that little map, and that little map's effectively a kind of mosaic gradient of what happens in Birmingham. And if you want to kind of visualize this gradient, and all I've done here is I've kind of used a little allometric equation, and I've tried to quantify the amount of carbon sequestration in tons per year that little gradient in Birmingham across the Birmingham conurbation provides at a 1 km square level. And it's a mean value, hence the error bars. This is our gradient depicted from OS maps from I've gone the wrong way, from very dense urban through to kind of suburban to our rural margins. And you can see a kind of increase in the amount of sequestration, and it's predominantly down to large woody plants, trees, for example. And a little kind of dip down here at the right on the margins. And that's quite interesting because our rural landscapes that we perceive as being very green, indeed they are, but they're not that wooded actually, particularly on the periphery of cityscapes. And this pattern is not unusual, and probably if I were to do this at a range of other cities, I would find fairly similar patterns, although I haven't tried to do that yet. So that's one kind of ecological function along that gradient. Now let's focus our attention on some of the other stuff. So this is our survey. These are bat species that we're looking at here. Some work that James Hale, Paul knows him really well, did whilst he was working as a postdoc with me and a doctoral student, looking at how the connectedness of landscapes within Birmingham influences the activity of bats around their feeding spaces. So this is our little kind of plot of the city. The darker green is the greener 1 km squares, the white is the less green 1 km squares, and the shades in between kind of indicate the variability along the gradient from the edge of the city to the city centre. You'll see it's more of a mosaic and less of a kind of donut type shape thing, but there is a kind of visible gradient. So what did we do? We went out to a run of ponds, 30 in the landscape, and we selected our ponds across that gradient. So we've got some in very connected habitats down here on the margins near Solihull. We've got some in very urban habitats in the city centre, and we've got others distributed across that network. So we've got a stratified sample of ponds. Now the bat species, they arrive at these ponds at night time and they feed on the emerging insects. It's like a kind of bat sushi bar. They zoom around the ponds just feeding themselves up, and they feed up all night, and then they move back to their roost sites and they rest up till the next feeding event the next day. And what we were trying to understand is, how does urbanization affect, or the connectivity of the system affect that level of activity, feeding activity by foraging bats on these ponds? So we used our remote sensing data and we utilized it to generate a three-dimensional layer where we were abstracting vegetation heights of different heights from 4, 6, 10, 15 meters high. And these correspond very particularly to the kind of heights that the normal common bat species operate at, and the sorts of flight mechanisms and flight trajectories that these bats have. And then we utilized the lowest level of that, 4 meter high, as a connectivity layer, and that provides us with some indication of the structure of the landscape, the connectedness of the landscape. And we sample that connectedness around each of these sample points 30 times in concentric buffers, and it gives us an index of the level of connectivity that the pond has in relation to the wider landscape where these bats might have been roosting. And then we utilized a range of walking transit surveys at night time and fixed surveys using anabats and sound record sound boxes to monitor bat activity from dawn till dusk at these 3 sites over May to August in 2009. And just to give you a kind of sense of how this works, this is common pipistrelle bat. It's our most common bats, but there are others in the network, the soprano pipistrelle, pygmaeus, Myotis dorbenton's bat, and then a range of nocturnal bats, high-flying, very fast-flying bats that you might see feeding around perhaps, I don't know, football stadia lights where moths are being brought in and they kind of move around those and they munch up all the moths. So a different range of species, a different range of bats. And then what we did is we used a range of different types of statistical modeling to try and understand how the built form of the landscape and the connectivity of the landscape influenced bat activity. And this is just one example of this bat here, the common pipistrelle. On our x-axis, we've got percentage built cover within 350 meter buffers around our sample sites. And we've got the number of bat activity minutes on the y-axis, which is smoothed, and this is just a general additive smoother. And you can see it kind of peaks in the middle, but when we get to areas where built landform is highly prevalent around feeding ponds, then the amount of bat activity reduces quite substantially. Now, what's really interesting about this study is it's looking at the structure of the landscape, and we're inferring movement from structural components. So that connectivity layer, those tree layers, those tree lines that are above 4 meters, is a kind of structural layer that we're utilizing to try and understand the presence of bats at a particular pond. Now, when you look at that and you stratify, so this is a really confusing plot, and it sends my students ballistic because it's actually kind of seems counterintuitive, but let me kind of walk you through it. What we've got are boxes here. We've got the area of connected tree cover of 4 meters and above within 150 meters of the ponds on this axis here, on the x-axis, and it's the same x-axis for all of these panels. And on the y-axis, it's the same y-axis for all of these panels. It's the number of active minutes for the common pipistrelle bat. And we're ranging here from the rural fringe class D through to suburban type landscapes into kind of densely built suburban landscapes, and then finishing in dense urban landscapes. And what we see with this particular species is that, notwithstanding that overall pattern of less bat activity where landscapes are highly urbanized, the importance of these tree lines increases as the landscape, the wider landscape, becomes more urbanized. And what you end up with is a very clear relationship between connectivity due to these tree lines in highly urbanized spaces. So those tree lines are providing structural connectivity to these bat species, which is permitting them to roost and move to feeding sites. And it's much more important in urban areas. And presumably it's much less important in rural areas because the landscape is much more permeable. And so there isn't the same reliance on tree layers to kind of move from forage to feed sites. And of course, we're mindful that you'll see, particularly things like pipistrelle bats feeding along these tree lines, actually utilizing them as food sources as well. So where they're more prevalent in the landscape, then it's much more likely you're going to get bats utilizing them. So that's a structural kind of pattern in the landscape, inferred from all of our kind of data collection and data manipulation linked to our understanding and generation of GIS-based data from remote sensing products. But it doesn't really get to the heart of the kind of thing, because we're inferring movement. We're not seeing it. It's really hard to track bats. In fact, most of the organisms that I study are really hard to track because they're tiny. So it's very difficult to follow the thing, to figure out where it's actually moving. To understand how the structure of the landscape affects movement is a really problematic thing. So this next study, which was done by former PhD student of mine, Emma Rosenfeld, utilizes ringing data to follow the thing. It's a study of passerine bird movement using ringing data from 2 types of green spaces in Birmingham. They're depicted here on this map. So this is Sutton Park in the north of the city, and we monitored sites around that in gardens and sites a little bit dislocated from it, but still down a river network. And this is the River Cole in the south of the city, and we monitored a whole run of sites down this river, looking at whether organisms utilize riparian corridors to move up and down. So the way we did it is we engaged with a whole range of volunteers, BTO ringing volunteers, and we trapped birds with mist nets, starting our surveys at 6 a.m. in the morning or 5 a.m. depending upon how light it was in the morning, and concluding by just around lunchtime. And we populated each of these sites with a team of ringers who were volunteers, and they worked simultaneously at various sites through 4 years, 2008, 9, 10 and 11. There's a total of 223 visits to the 27 sites on the network, and we captured and ringed very, very many thousands of birds, and it equated to about 12,000 hours of effort with the volunteer ringing teams. What came out of that was 1,087 retrap records and paired records of birds that we've retrapped multiple times. 837 of those, and 249 of these little birds moved from one area to the next across the study period. So what this allows us to do is to look at movement in relation to the structure of the landscape. So we did the same sort of stuff. We utilized our remote sensing data. We generated a structural network utilizing gap distances of about 30 meters, and we monitored bird movement. And the largest number of movements were recorded by the most common birds, rather unsurprisingly, great tits, Eurasian blue tits, then long-tailed tits, European robins. And some of these birds moved absolutely miles. Some of our colouring birds turned up in Wigan. A little goldcrest that we captured in the south of Birmingham ended up in Hereford. So that these birds can move very long distances right outside of our study. The maximum distances are listed here, so you can see that some birds moving, a good few kilometers, 13k, 14k, even little ones like wrens, fairly good distance of movements. But what was really interesting is when we tried to model the probability of movement and the directionality of movement, we used some regressional models. I'll just give you one example here to make the point. This is a blue tit. The picture that you can see is a juvenile. You can tell he's a juvenile because he's still got his little yellow cheeks, which he had, or she had, when he was in a nestling. And what we showed in this study is that the movement is directional. So if birds are ringed in areas that are heavily built up, then there's a high probability that the next time we find them, they've moved somewhere else. So it's almost like the smaller, heavily urbanized sites are effectively sinks. So juvenile birds are moving away from these sites, and they are selecting sites that are much better connected within the network. And that's depicted by this other probability plot on the other side. And our best kind of fit model utilizing this logistic regression approach indicates that the connected habitat is highly significant, and particularly for adult birds. So adults, particularly first-year juvenile birds, it's very common for passerine juvenile birds to move away from natal habitats within their first year, effectively. So we see this pattern quite clearly in our adult birds, and what it's telling us is that those structural things that appear to be influencing the bats certainly influence the movement of these birds, because these are documented movements from built-up sites to less built-up sites that are better connected in the networks. And it's one of the few studies that's been able to document this for species of animal that are too small to carry other ways of monitoring movement. So things like GPS tags and even radio tags, because these birds are really small. The average great tit's about 11 grams. So you're not going to stick a GPS tag on it. And obviously the average beetle wouldn't be moving if you put a tag on it, even a radio tag. So it's a documented movement, which I think is really quite positive. So this led me to think a little bit about other stuff that goes on in the landscape. So this kind of focus on movement, and it made me think a little bit about what else could interrupt movement patterns in landscapes. And one of the obvious things that could have an influence is this thing, artificial light at night, or ALAN, as it's quaintly known. This little plot here just shows the UK at night. It's derived from the Royal Commission Environmental Pollution Report, which was generated in 2009. And this little plot here just looks at the percentage change over the sample period, which I'm squinting at, was from 1993 to 2000 for this particular report. And what I think what's really interesting here is this plot here is the kind of mirror image of this plot. So these bright colors here are, bright skies. This is, I think, irradiance depicted in the colors. You can identify London, Birmingham. You can identify Liverpool, Manchester, right up through Northumbria, Sunderland, Newcastle, and then down the kind of linking corridor between Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland, really bright. But look what's happened over the period. Our nighttime skies have actually lightened outside of our cities. The increased here in yellow, increasing, and the white is no change. So there's not been much change in cities. They've not become too much brighter, but our rural landscapes have certainly brightened up. Maybe that's an interesting finding. So what is the likely outcome of artificial light for organisms? So just a quick whiz through the literature from Gaston's mob, some work from the group in Belgium, and a whole range of academics across the world, just to give you a sense of what the likely impacts are. And then I want to focus my attention on movement of bat species to kind of track that connectivity thing through. So it's influenced time budgets for diurnal, nocturnal and crepuscular species. So the amount of light is affecting when organisms are active and what they're doing when they're active. And that influences certainly nocturnal species, but it's also extending diurnal ranges for diurnal organisms, and crepuscular species are being crunched at both ends. So the time movement sort of activities are being modified. There's also very well-known flight to light responses that can impact and foraging movement patterns on organisms. There's a brilliant paper in the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences in the States of the what is it, 9/11 monument in New York, which was a incredibly bright light that was shone up into the sky over the two towers as a monument. And someone was mapping movement of migratory birds when that went on. And what they noticed was a movement in of migratory birds when the light was on. And then they switched the light on and off, and they noticed that that flux varied. So very noticeable flight to light responses, and they impact migration patterns, they impact movement patterns, they can impact foraging patterns, and they can also lead into large-scale mortality. There's some very shocking work by a group out in Canada looking at building strikes, lit building strikes by birds that cause mortality, and a really famous study of a Lake Erie lighthouse being switched on and off, and the reduction in mortality from bird strikes when it's off. So some fascinating stuff there. The other things that happen is there's functional impacts in terms of services, pollination, particularly nighttime pollination, which is predominantly done by our hawk moths, can be affected in the presence of night, or can be enhanced or not enhanced. And then there's likely knock-on issues in terms of ecological networks and food web issues in the way that the trophic cascades, bottom-up, top-down cascades are constructed. So all about is pretty well known. But let's think a little bit about tracking our bat story through. So I'm going to start by pointing to some work done by Stone down at Bristol University with her supervisors. And this is a really interesting study, an experimental study looking at how sticking lighting infrastructure into the routeways, commuting routes of this particular bat, which is the lesser horseshoe bat. And what they did is they utilized generators, they mapped the looks, the brightness of generalized road lighting, and they set up on these hedgerows a lighting experiment, and they turned them on and off. So you've got these lights, they're simulating the kind of brightness that you would find in the average road lighting system at that point in time, which was not LED, non-LED technology. They've subsequently gone on to use LEDs and repeated the study and not found such significant results, which is an interesting story. I'm not going to talk about that today. So what they did is they had a control period. So they monitored these things over a number of nights. They had controls where everything was installed, but there was no lighting, there was no generator. They had a noise treatment where they switched on the generators, but not the lights. And the rationale there is that obviously bats move ultrasonic, using ultrasonic frequencies, and we know that engines can generate quite high frequency sounds that are not audible to us, that may be audible to bats. And then they had 4 lit treatments where the lights were put on and off, and then they repeated the noise treatment at the end of it, as they did in night 2, and that thing's repeated. So what they're doing is they're effectively experimentally testing whether any bats are moving up and down this network across by these hedgerows in the presence of light. And what we see here is quite a strong treatment effect. So when we lit the bat up, the number of passes is markedly reduced, and it's visible here. And there's a difference between the control, which is a kind of darkened sky where you get much more movement, and the lit treatments, which indicate a significant decrease in movement. And of course, there is an impact of noise, which would be expected. Now, this is a kind of slow flying bat. It emerges late. It's got a wing architecture that means it is quite maneuverable, but it's slow moving. So, you know, maybe predation avoidance is a core outcome here. So when we saw that study, James and I thought, well, that would be really interesting, but how does that work at a landscape level? So what we did is we tried to operationalize this at landscape level. So we utilized Birmingham. We focused our attention on gaps in tree lines, much in the same way we did with our structural work. And we surveyed bats moving across gaps. And we found a range of gaps of different sizes from about 80, so up to 80 meters in distance, down to about 10 to 12 meters, with different levels of brightness associated with them in terms of the amount of lighting. And we utilized remote sensing data for the lighting stuff, aerial data, and we validated the brightness of those aerial data on the ground by going around and trying to establish how bright they were. So we identified them on our digital GIS maps, and then we created a little validation equation by pointing stuff at the light to assess its brightness. And we use that to quantify this kind of gap size, brightness sort of matrix. And then we went out and did, I say we, it's a royal we, isn't it? I didn't do any of this. James did all of it. I just watched him do it. So I'll own to that, and my apologies. Royal we is the malaise of all old academics. So yeah, out, do the monitoring. And then we utilized the bat crossing data to generate a logistic regression model to understand when and where bats crossed. And then we utilized that model in a GIS to generate a resistance layer. And then we just dialed up the city lighting to try and understand what would happen if we darken the skies in terms of connectivity, and what would happen if we dialed it up to about 20 lux, which is pretty bright, but not unreasonably bright, and is a possible, likely possibility if people wanted to have a bright sky. It could be done that way. So that was our research design. This is what we did. And we've got our little tree line networks, we've got our road architecture, we've got our bright lights, and we sampled in transects across for bat movement. We have people at either end with bat detectors. And because we can't be sure that there's any bat detectors are not fantastically directional, they kind of capture wherever within a range. It could be either side of you, you wouldn't really know, it just says there's a bat there. We looked for movement and we monitored movement across the site. So people sat there and watched where the bats flew. So we're kind of monitoring what route they're taking across these gaps. You can see that the gaps are variable in terms of brightness, where each lamp is. Do they take dark routes? Do they take bright routes? Okay, and then we utilize that probability of cross in relation to gap size and gap brightness to generate these models. And we did that at 27 sites for kind of 1.5 hours following dusk at a range of sites across a year. Now, just to show you that to be absolutely sure that the bat did cross the road, James et al. Sat there with cars with thermal imaging cameras in a car watching bats move across the road. So this is a video from that thermal imaging work. Yeah, he's amazing, didn't get arrested. So I'm going to click on this now. What you're going to see some cars moving down here, which are very bright, obviously. And then you're going to see a bat zoom across somewhere like that. Here we go. There he goes. Okay, so that bat crossed the gap. Okay, and the car's pulling off into the background there. So it came in that way and it went that way. So that allowed us to quantify where the bat moved across that space in 3 dimensions. And it also allowed us to quantify whether the bat actually did cross the road or whether it turned back and went in the other direction, because we'd have still got a hit off the bat detectors and possibly either side because of the range of them. So a useful validation task. Okay. So what did we find out? Well, what we found out is that, as not surprisingly, as gaps got bigger, fewer bats crossed. So this is the outcome from our probability model up here. It's got fails and crosses. So we've got in the kind of, I suppose, salmon pink color above, we've got our fails, below we've got our crosses. And this line here represents the Lux value, which the probability of a cross from our regression models, our logistic regression model, is about 5%. So what you see is an interaction in terms of distance and brightness. Okay, so longer distances reduce bat crosses, but also brighter gaps reduce bat crosses. So we get this interaction. And then when you take that little relationship, you can model it at a pixel level across a landscape utilizing the remote sensing data sets on sky brightness and bat crosses in terms of the kind of metrics of gap size. And then you can start to model what would happen. So what was done was model data utilizing 2009 lighting data and accessible land cover. And what we find is that built surfaces accounted for about 25%. Land cover was highest in areas where built surfaces account for about 25% of the landscape. So what that means is there's much more bat activity, much more crossing where we've got much less built form. And that drops quite markedly as the built cover increases. So about 65%, and you can see it depicted very clearly here on this plot. So the loss in accessible area due to this barrier effect of these gaps and these networks increases past about 60%. Now, once we've got that model, we can literally just dial up the pixels. So literally turn up the brightness, flip it up, and we can compare that to a dark baseline model where there's no lights. We switch them all off, and then we can light them up. So the dark baseline model was run, and the lighting levels as we measured them in 2009 was run, and that reduced the amount of percentage accessible land cover surrounding the ponds that were studied by about 5% in heavily built up areas. And if we dial up our brightness scenario to punch 20 lux into the sky, into the lights, then we lose 7%, and it's depicted here in this kind of change in the slopes of these little regression plot scans here. But the other thing that came out of this, you think about, we've got these bands, these transect bands across the road, is that the bats generally took the darkest route across the gap. So they're literally moving to find their way through the darkest kind of tunnels across those roads. And that almost certainly is a predation avoidance mechanism. And there are anecdotal data that indicate predation of bat species by essentially diurnal raptors, as well as some nocturnal species too. So it's probably predator avoidance, but there we go. So that's the kind of interaction there with how we manage our urban landscapes and what we do with our urban infrastructure with the overall land use, land cover story that I've been developing, that shows that you're actually adding an extra layer on top in terms of impeding a core ecological function, i.e. movement across a cityscape. Now, there are other things that go on. Now, I've not done any of this work, but I've popped it up because it's an emerging area and it's fascinating to me. So I've got a couple of little examples to try and explore what happens in the presence of noise. So the bioacoustics of noise pollution. Now, what the likely impacts are, there's been a lot of emphasis on organisms that utilize sound to kind of communicate, so singing stuff. So birds, for example, and mating behaviors. And there's been work looking at what happens in the presence of artificial sound for predator avoidance, vigilance, and foraging time. And then probably a little bit less on foraging success and prey capture, and less still on where organisms choose to have nests, hibernacula and the like, and territory creation. Is it an urban issue? It surely is. This is a map of sound for Birmingham. It's derived for sure, it's modelled, and it clearly shows that most of the sound generation in the conurbation of Birmingham is related to our transport corridors. And they're clearly visible here is our road map of Birmingham effectively. And now if I were to stick up a lighting map at night, it would be almost similar. It will be pretty similar, as you can imagine, because most of our street lamps follow road networks. Yeah. So there's a bit of covariability, and we'll come back to that as we close off today's chat. This is a kind of expanded version of it. You can see that the sound pollution attenuates away from the road into green spaces. So potentially there is an issue. Now, I haven't done anything study-wise, but I picked 3 studies that kind of point out the problem, the potential problem. This is a really interesting study by a group at Aberystwyth University. It's part of a PhD study. It's pretty dated, but it is fascinating. It's a study of 20 populations of great tits, where they monitored 20 different cities, captured background sound recording, recorded tit song, and then what they did that's really interesting is they played back song that was recorded by rural communities to urban communities and checked the male response. Really fascinating. So here's some data for you. Here's the rural recordings, urban recordings, and the range of mean noise measurements in terms of minimum decibels, maximum decibels, and mean urban, rural. And here's the playback areas. Again, same pattern. So they're recording birds in noisy environments and they're recording birds in quiet environments, and then they're playing back those recordings to birds in noisy and quiet. Really fascinating. These little sonograms down here just depict the pattern. I don't know whether you do any bird watching, but allegedly great tits have got very simple songs. It effectively goes teacher, so it's 2 syllables punched out, but there's at least 100 different forms of dialect related to that 2-tone motif. And these sonograms depict the frequency at which the song is being pushed out into the landscape. So what did they find? So what they found, firstly, is something that was actually known already, something known as the Lombard effect, which indicates that in the presence of low frequency sounds, which are predominantly generated by traffic noise in cityscapes and some industrial noise, when we had heavier industries, it would have been worse, I'm sure, but not nowadays. And what has been found in terms of the spectral signal is that the birds are singing at a different frequency. So their minimum frequency is up. So birds singing in noisier environments pitch up. So they become more soprano, if you like. Okay, that's kind of known. A lot of research has shown that. But what makes this study so interesting and so, I think, important is that cross of playback from noisy environments to quieter environments elicited a different response from male territory holders. So males from quiet territories exhibited a very strong response when hearing a song from a territory holder with lower background noise than with higher background noise, and the flip in birds in noisier territories. So what that means is that these birds are responding much more negatively or to birds that are recorded in different environments, different levels of sound. Now, given that sound is integral to the sustenance of these populations because they are monogamous songbirds and they sing to attract mates and to hold down territories, the implications of that in terms of likely outcomes for maybe speciation across pools of urban rural populations is, I think, quite interesting. So we know that there's a kind of behavioral response for oral communicators. We also know that in the presence of song that some species do things differently. So this is a really fascinating study by Quinn from Canada, looking at good old chaffinches and trying to understand what would happen if you play artificially kind of artificial sound to these organisms whilst they're feeding. So this was done as an experiment. It's in the Journal of Avian Biology. It's an experimental biological study. And they utilized the foraging activity of chaffinch. Now, if you've got garden bird feeders, you'll know that chaffinches tend to feed on the ground. So they spend a lot of time pecking to pick up seed. And that process of head down is punctuated by head up. And the head up is when they're looking to see when the neighbor's cat's going to eat them. So head down when they're feeding, head up when they're being vigilant. And what this study shows is that in the presence of artificially enhanced noise, the effect of noise impacts head down activity in relation to head up. So the organisms are having to look a bit more in noisier places. Also, pretty important in terms of feeding. Now that activity cuts right the way across to foraging activity, and this is another little experimental study just to seal off this little tail of noise pollution of bats. And this is a kind of choice chamber experiment. It's an experimental study where different types of sounds were played in areas where bats are feeding and being fed. And on the y-axis here, we've got the number of captures of prey by the bats in their little chambers in the presence of silence in traffic and vegetation and noise. And what you can see is that the captures, the prey captures, are influenced by the level of sound and level of noise. And that's probably not surprising because bats, you know, they feed with echolocation. So that noise is going to have an impact on their feeding activity. And it's clearly depicted here in terms of a noisy white noise, vegetation noise, traffic noise, and then overall silence, with quite clear differences in the number of captures in their little choice experiment chambers. So another fantastically illuminating study indicating that what we do in cityscapes in terms of generation of noise could have perhaps unforeseen and maybe not unexpected, but unforeseen circumstances for key elements of the foraging of particular species. And I thought it was nice to track the bird and the bat story through, because they're the things that we were structurally and functionally thinking about when we were looking at our overall landscape metrics. So the thing about urban systems is that a lot of this stuff kind of co-varies. So this, just to make the point that we need to be mindful of the fact that it's very difficult to elicit cause when we're dealing, even with less so with our experimental studies because we can partition it out. But when you're empirically working in the environment, it's very difficult to disentangle the driving things. So this is a study by Richard Fuller. It looks at singing robins. That we know that you'll recognize this as you walk your dogs and you walk to and fro from work at nighttime, at dusk, that birds sing later in the day, and some of them are singing right into the kind of dark. So blackbirds, song thrush, robins, renowned for it, nighttime singing. And this study looks at the square root of nighttime light, measures the intensity of lux, similar to the stuff we've been doing, no nighttime singing and night singing. See a clear difference. It looks super persuasive, doesn't it? But when you look at the number of nighttime, the nighttime intensity of lux and the daytime noise generated by roads, you see a fairly strong positive one-to-one relationship. So it becomes quite difficult to disentangle in the empirical studies at a landscape scale what is actually driving this outcome of enhanced singing. In this particular instance, is it daytime noise? Is it just that it's a real effort to sing over noise, and traffic gets going very early in cityscapes, so it can coincide with the dawn chorus? Maybe they just do it at a different point in the day, and maybe late at night after the traffic is kind of dwindled and the kind of commute home is finished, is a displacement. Yeah. So it could be sound, or it could be the fact that they're utilizing the available light to do things differently. Now, we've got some really interesting data from blackbirds and geolocator data sets that show that blackbirds are actually foraging later into the night. So we know that they're active looking for food because you can see that they're moving around. Some great work by a chap who's now working up at the University of Glasgow, Davide Lomellini. So yeah, fantastic stuff. Right, so where have we been? So a quick whistle-stop tour through kind of 15 years of research that I've been engaging with, but also a considerable amount of other research that people have been undertaking. What we know is that the land use land cover patterns in our urban systems clearly impact urban biodiversity. And that has a knock-on in terms of service provision, the assembly of organisms into recognizable assemblages and particular habitats across the cityscape. And we know, importantly, that those patterns of land cover and land use influence the ecological functions. So I pointed a very strong story around connectivity, but I could have looked at a range of other ecological services and developed similar ideas to kind of make the link between structure, form, and overall function and service provision. And then layered on top of this, we've got the stuff that we do that maybe slightly unintended, the way that we generate urban infrastructure, that patterns and adds an additional kind of element on top, which mix artificial light pollution with sound pollution, can influence those very same ecological functions. And I've given you a number of examples related predominantly to that core process of connectivity that links species pools together. Right, I'm done. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop my screen share.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe a round of applause for those who are moved. Very good, John. Thanks a lot. Dave.
Yeah. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet. Is there one? I can't find it.
I think we know what the answer is. It's going to be yes.
I can't see a question.
I can't see a question.
Can we have a copy of the slides, please?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Actually, what I meant to show is that I've got a list of. Can I just share my screen again? Because I forgot to pop up my collaborators, and that's a grievous sin. I must do that. I apologize. Just bear with me. I shouldn't have done that. So, yes, variously funded by funding bodies, also lottery funds, also overseas funds for postdoctoral researchers. And the people that did all of that work are listed there. I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. They're ordered alphabetically. And they were ably assisted by Birmingham Bird Ringing Group, Garden Moth Scheme Group, the Opal National Survey respondents, and the Birmingham Black Country Bat Group, who all volunteered and helped us do our survey work. And if you're interested in the readings, they are listed there and will be made available to you.
That's amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. I think you've been speaking for a real long time. Are you still okay to take a few questions?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Okay, well, I couldn't see that question in the chat, so I don't quite know why. Maybe there are some others I can't see.
Maybe it's only to me.
Probably to you.
All right, okay. Well, I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, okay. Well, we will put the slides on or make them accessible from our website, and also the recording, I think, because you put so much into that, Jonathan. There's such a lot of material, such a lot of interesting stuff. I think people will need a bit more time to kind of digest it all.
Yeah, it was a bit of a kind of 10-year kind of potted history, I guess.
Yeah.
Kind of where I'm at with my brain right now. You know, I'm getting towards the end of a lengthy career, and it's kind of coalescing a bit. So yeah.
So the wisdom of aging
has its benefits. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question, John, and perhaps without going into the chat? Well, I suppose it is. Clearly, there are these effects, and we don't ultimately know what sort of, how, whether serious consequences, arise from them. I just wonder whether, how much is the authorities, people who put up lights or plan roads or do all that kind of stuff, or even decide where to build, are sort of aware of this or acts as a in some sort of take into account in what they do.
Yeah, just hold on, I'll switch the light on. I'm sitting in the dark.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize how dark it was. Yeah, I think the answer to that is probably not that much, actually. I mean, there is a lot of information out there now. There's reports by NGOs There's reports by the Royal Commission. Is a pretty punchy report, actually, if you want to look at it. In 2009, there's a good report by Bug Life on the influence of this for bugs and invertebrate species. So there's a reasonable amount out there, and there is a huge chunk of scientific literature being generated through, well, you know, for the Lonnie Network and the work of Kevin Gaston down in Exeter, Franz Halke over in Berlin, and then the guy who set it in train over in the States. You know, there's a mountain of Travis Longcore. There's a mountain of stuff out there.
Yeah,
I don't think it takes it into policy in the way it ought to.
Yeah, yeah.
And can I ask a question, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Roger Catchpole. Connectivity in a way it's in the eyes, ears and chemoreceptors of the particular organism that you look at. And have you looked at developing resistant surfaces for less mobile species? Because you've highlighted quite fragile species in your talk. What luck have you had with more sedentary species that move less? I'm thinking particularly of invertebrates.
Yeah, or zero. It's really hard. It's really hard to show. There's a really interesting project that's just kicking off at Leeds University biology department. Chris Hassel's leading it, looking at radar technologies for mapping movement of biodiversity in time and space. And that, although it might not necessarily, well, it won't, what it won't provide very easily is individual track movement, because you can't track small organisms in that way, but it might give us an indication of overall biomass fluxes for species that are not readily amenable to be tracked very directly. Because even our smallest tags, I have seen radio tags on beetles, for example, so you can tag them, but they're not very mobile when they've got little antennae on their elytral cases, because it's going to impede their movement, and you know they're certainly not going to fly. I spent a happy summer sticking tiny radio tags onto a very famous chafer beetle known as a noble chafer that resides on ancient orchards, to try and understand where it moved when it dispersed, because they can spend 3 or 4 years in the rotting heartwood of a plum tree, and then they come out and they emerge and they disappear. And we tried to track those with radio tags, and they basically, as soon as they were tagged, even though the tags were tiny, they just didn't move. So we had to remove the tags. So it's really difficult to do, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and have you also looked at different land use classifications and how that helps you to define connectivity in different ways? Because a lot of connectivity, particularly in conservation and policy, is focused on physical connectance, whereas it's a functional property of how the species interact with different landscape features. Have you played around with the classifications in that way?
We have. We played around with parameterizing structural models in very different ways. But ultimately, unless you're following the thing, you don't really get at function. I mean, you've just got to be able to track the thing. I've got my own radar project actually with a staring radar, which will give tracks. So it's currently staring across towards the city centre from campus, and it's monitoring bird movement in the sky in a kind of big slice, and that's going to give us real bird tracks. So that's on smallish species too, that perhaps we wouldn't be sticking geolocators on. But you know, the technology is shrinking all the time, so we've got some tags and some base stations that we're going to use on blackbirds to look at movement, GPS tags that are small enough and they're telemetry based, so when the bird comes back towards the base station, it downloads the data instantly, and they're solar powered. So the kit's getting better and better over the years. So I don't know whether you're a wildlife fiend like me, but gone are the days where the GPS tag around the elephant was about this size. Those days are over now. The tags are much smaller.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is another question. Well, actually, Katie Hockridge said she's seen tags on moving bees,
Yeah,
which is interesting.
yeah,
And
the radio tags for sure.
yeah, Andy has said, have any studies been done on the effect of increasing concreting over of urban gardens and
Yeah.
felling of garden trees?
There was a whole study. Gosh, I'm going to sound like the Kevin Gaston fan club here, but it was Kevin Gaston who did this. He did a whole study looking at, it's called Bugs, Biodiversity in Urban Gardens. It was based in Sheffield. And then he had a subsequent grant under the Sustainable Urban Environments Programme of EPSRC. And he looked at, I think, is it 5 different cities, Liverpool, Leicester, Sheffield, a range of different cities, and answered that very question. So I can only endorse you, go have a look at it. So yeah, there is. And there's some really fascinating work done by a guy called Jamie Kirkpatrick in Australia, looking at the influence of paving over front gardens. And that's a pattern that is pervasive, particularly in cities like London, where people can't park on the road. So front gardens are disappearing and being paved. And there's some quite interesting work in Australasia looking at that. I don't know whether there's any equivalent studies in the UK, but yeah, have a look at the Bugs data set. Brilliant.
Certainly quite a lot of paving over in gardens in Headingley.
Yeah. And Birmingham too.
Well, really everywhere, I think. Christina, did you want to say something?
Yes, please. We've had a bang on our window and then it was all cracked, and I presume it was a bird, and it was about 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
The birds flying around at night now.
Yeah, they can be spooked. So if they're spooked by an owl or something and they're caught foraging, there's a good chance they could be moving. Yeah, and it's not unusual. I don't know whether you've seen those kind of owl print sort of window prints that people post on social media, where a bird has hit a window and you've got that kind of wing print. So it's not super common. But it's not unusual. And in fact, all of that information I was talking about in terms of flight to light mortality is bird strikes on windows flying to bright lit buildings. And this is work done by Travis Longcore. And some of the estimates of mortality scaled across cityscapes are eye-watering. It's amazing. And there is a network for this, a global network looking at bird strike deaths on bright light buildings, where citizen science activities are kind of generating larger data sets. So that's a pan-American network. It's already in existence. So yeah.
Do you think that the movement sensitive lights are confusing animals? I never thought about it, but it seems a bit cruel now.
I think they're going to have an influence in some shape. I don't know what that will be. Someone once asked me about firework displays and light displays and whether they'd have an impact as well. But with light pollution, it's the kind of persistence of the pulse, really. So the flight to light responses require quite consistent light on.
Yeah.
So maybe I don't actually know your answer to your question, Christina, but my hunch is it's not as significant as if the lights are on constantly, but it could have an impact. It certainly have an impact in terms of foraging animals. If the light goes on in a garden, an organism's going to stop doing what it's doing if it's nocturnal. But whether that has an influence in terms of fitness and outcome, I don't know.
I was wondering whether there's any signs of kind of migratory behavior. Are insects, birds, whatever, likely to move, or do they just adapt their behavior to suit the changing surroundings?
There's a lot of behavioural adaptation for sure. In terms of movement, there's a couple of studies. If you look at the Cornell University eBird website, there's a current call. In fact, it popped across on a social media post this week, strangely enough, talking about a policy that they're trying to engage with in the US to turn off lights at night time because it's passes migration time. and we know that the passage migrants go north to south, and we know that they are attracted to bright light situations. It's a form of ecological sink. It draws them in, and sometimes they collide with buildings and die, but other times they settle and they're rested and they're effectively out of that migration pathway. So we know that migration for sure is impacted by artificial light. Have a look at the Cornell website. There's some fascinating stuff there just being developed, looking very directly at that influence of light, artificial light on migratory patterns.
Yes, I was talking to John Cooper at Rodley Nature Reserve last week, and he's done some really, he's a really good birder, and he's done some really good studies on microscope scoping at night. That means that he can hear, he analyzes the sonographs the next morning, what's gone over, and he's an incredibly good birder. And he was saying some amazing stuff. Obviously red wings, we know about red wings, we can all hear, most of us can hear those, but he was talking about moorhen and coot. I'm sure he said moorhen and coot. And obviously it's difficult to analyze what bird's making this, but obviously these people who are scoping at night and recording everything at night, they're getting some very interesting stuff, and obviously they're all liaising together. This is over Armley in Leeds, you know, an inner city ward in Leeds. So it's really worth talking to these people, and I'm sure somebody could get data from them.
For sure. I mean, we're using our staring radar to quantify that flighted biomass nocturnal diurnal fluxes. It's one of the things that's part of the project. But yeah, I'm not surprised.
There are concerns about the colour temperature of light, aren't there? That
yeah,
you know, these super white, bluey white lights, you know, are more allegedly, well, they're said to be more damaging because they're more like, you know, hardcore daylight, if you like, rather than the softer kind of, you know, sort of lower temperature ones, are sort of more warm colours that are more like, you know, maybe it's a light and, you know, it's hard to, you know, it's not a natural thing, but it's probably less damaging because it's more like sunset or you know, the kind of colours there. I mean,
I think that depends on the architecture of eyes for the organisms involved and how.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, Stone work on that metal horseshoe bat. They repeated their experiment using LED technologies, and they found a much weaker response
Right.
pass, which was interesting to me, because I would have envisioned, like you, I was thinking it's much more like daylight, so it's got to have a bigger impact. But they didn't see it in their experimental study. It's exactly the same experiment, so literally the same, just with a different bulb, effectively, which was fascinating. But that kind of blue, brighter system for other organisms, it is definitely going to be down to architecture of eyes and how the cones receptors are built in eyes and how they function.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think that isn't that a problem? A lot of these human kind of, you know, imposed changes on the landscape, you know, they will affect different species differently because they're all different, you know. So as you say, the eyes of things. I mean, whereas you speak to lighting engineers or lighting types, they're kind of, you know, it's just whether human beings can see all right with them. You know, that's their concern. It's not what the knock-on effects to all the other millions of species there are about.
Oh, for sure. You know, when you study the outcomes of processes in the environment, you do realise that there's such a strong species. It's quite difficult to generalise.
Oh, you missed some of that. It was a bit of a hissing noise going on somewhere.
So I guess the problem that we have when we deal with lighting engineers and landscape planners and all the rest of it is that they want a kind of clear-cut story, and the story we're offering them is that, yeah, there's these kind of broadish generalized patterns, but within it there's huge variability which is species specific. So what works for an organism might not be the same for another organism, and suddenly that translation of hard science finding into policy practice becomes a really tricky task, because it's a question. When I'm asked the question, I go, it depends. They just, nobody wants to know it depends. They want, this is the answer to your problem, but that's not how ecology works. The species are species and they operate very differently, so the responses are different. It's really,
I suppose it's have less of it, just calm down a bit.
yeah, sure.
Could I just come in there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I've been cut off from my other computer and you probably can't see me, but that's okay. I'm just really interested in what you've been saying tonight. And basically, you know, you've said that connectivity of landscapes, which is really important, biological, and in urban situations, there's varied responses. But what I want to actually, and you've concentrated very importantly tonight on the idea of lighting, you know, which obviously affects us all, and very much so, different kinds of animal and plant species. What I want to actually ask you is, what about the digital situation, you know, like electromagnetic frequencies, which are actually, you know, coming from mobile phone towers, that must, I know that the idea of smart cities, where they've actually proposed, well, that's okay, you know, we'll get the lights put up and we'll turn them down at night, but there's still the electromagnetic frequencies that will be transmitted, and that must affect, you know, wildlife, plant life, and our lives possibly to a certain extent. But I just wondered what your views were on that.
I'm not aware of any good examples of research looking at it, apart from kind of tourist arguments about radio mass. There are a range of other environmental variables that lead to light.
A bit of hissing again somewhere. Helen, do you think you could turn? Yeah.
It's Helen's microphone that's causing the noise, so I just turned it off.
Yeah, so I think the answer is there's not sufficient data to draw any firm conclusions, but I'm always mindful of correlative empirical studies that link things together in that way, because there are lots of things going on in environments that lead to particular outcomes, and you've got to be very careful of tracking down that links, the causality links, to make sure that A does end up generating B, but it's actually being caused by C, D, E, and F, and you've not measured that, so you don't really know. So I'm super cautious when I see empirical kind of studies that do that, because it's correlation, and it could be something else that's driving the pattern. So I'm much keener to kind of focus my attention on experimental type studies that kind of focus on the one thing. So if they're interested in electromagnetic fluxing, then study the thing and look at the influence in a controlled environment, and then maybe then take your examples out to the field and try and disentangle what would be a really noisy kind of experimental design. So we've got to be super careful, actually.
Yeah, I think there's lots of questions as to the effects on humans, never mind anything else with electromagnetic waves.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think there are any other questions. I just want to thank you very much, Jonathan, for all that work. And as you come to the end of your career, at least, I'm sure your interest won't be stopping, because you seem very passionate about what you're doing.
No, I've already got a kind of projects linked to local dippers and things that are in my field of view.
Excellent.
Retirement fund.
Well, I think it was also good what you showed, how many volunteer groups are actually helping with the research as well.
Without them. You can't be everywhere at once. You know, if we get a project funded, I might have one postdoc and one PhD student, and I'll say, yeah, your landscape is Birmingham, it's only 30 miles square, and people go, oh no.
Sorry, Andy's got his hand up. Andy West.
Really important. Yeah, Andy.
Hi. Hello.
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 Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I wasn't sure you could hear me. Thanks for an interesting talk tonight, Jonathan. I just want to really sort of highlight an observation, really, which is that the last questioner talked about policies that quite a lot of councils have been adopting, which is to turn off or down street lighting and city lights, shop lights at night. But I do gather, and I don't know whether people like you are influencing or feeding into these policies, but I've noticed that now quite a lot of pressure groups are trying to convince councils to overturn this policy because of fears, especially by women, that they're possibly less safe at night, especially after this lady was murdered in London. I don't know whether you've got any comments to make about that.
I think it's a really emotive issue. I know Norfolk Council did this, and the BTO monitored bat activity through the switch off at 12. Fascinating, and it did show that, yeah, it has a real influence on that. I know also that people's views on lighting, they're very bimodal, and there's a lot of fear associated with not being able to see. And when you engage with local people in discussing outcomes, sometimes you get an answer you don't want to hear. So people just do not want to entertain the idea that it will be darker at night. But there's a significant body of evidence on lighting and crime that indicates the pattern is the opposite. Some great work done by psychologists called Q in the States looking at this, and the patterns tend to be the opposite. So I don't necessarily think that the balance of the empirical evidence indicates that dark equals more crime. Dark equals different environment, maybe. But, you know, people have their views, and I think we have to be mindful and respectful of those. And as we move towards the policies that are kind of neighbourhood-based planning type policies, then I think that kind of contestation of empirical data and our need is going to become more prevalent. But, you know, I don't think in a kind of functional democracy we should be in a position where we say, this is how it should be. I think we just have to engage in dialogue and provide sufficient amount of empirical evidence so people can fully evaluate what's happening. And that's the gap. It's not done effectively in my mind. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's, you know, it's a very delicate situation, and you can get some really targeted kind of, whoa, where did that come from sort of responses, and it's quite difficult to deal with as a scientist. So
yeah. Yes, I agree. I think one of the real big problems in trying to convince people about this, about the wisdom of this, is the counterintuitiveness that less light is actually safer, or at least not as unsafe as people think it is.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you think about, so, you know, I live in Birmingham, right? We have tunnels. On a bright summer day, when you enter the Queensway Tunnel, you have to enter it really slowly if you haven't got sunglasses on, because your eyes don't adjust to the dark instantly. So if you go careering into it, you could end up hitting the wall, because your visual field just does not compensate quick enough for that change from bright sunshine to quite dark. Now that happens in lighting. Yeah. So when you move from areas of bright light into dark, your eyes take time to adjust. Yet if you had mediated duller lighting, your eyes would adjust. Yeah. So you'd be able to see maybe better.
Yeah.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's real enough.
Absolutely.
One of the things was that big study, you know, 62 councils involved, and part of that was some qualitative research where they had dimming, and a lot of people didn't notice it. You know, you don't have to, you know, the lights are still on, but they just weren't as bright, you know, and people, you know, most people weren't bothered by that. And that might be something for the smart cities where it can be just, you know, just calm down a bit, and you know, in the early hours of the, you know.
Yeah.
Instead of just turning everything off completely.
Yeah. I don't think much of that goes on. I mean, well, maybe, yeah, some of it.
There are quite a number of councils that do have a 12 to whatever 6 switch off or whatever it's called.
Yeah, park night lighting.
Yeah.
Although I gather that the main driver for that is to save money, so I'm told.
May well be, yeah. But there isn't any, there is a benefit to it in terms of wildlife, I think.
Well, it almost seems like a sort of a conveniently good side effect rather than a main reason for doing it.
That's probably true. But we take the wins where we see them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fair enough.
Anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again. I think we've probably come to the end now. I think you probably deserve a drink, Jonathan.
My glass is empty.
Whenever you're in Headingley, let us know.
We'll buy a pint or two.
That'd be great. Okay.
Can I just, yeah. But I don't want to forget to say we've got the one coming up May the 24th, I think. Next Cafe Scientifique is on called Electric Vehicles, a silver bullet to decarbonise transport, ? Is the next one. So that's one coming up. I don't want to forget to say that, but just to say, emphasise what David said. I mean, thank you very much for turning out and putting all that stuff together. It's quite a compendium of material there, and very useful. And thanks again for offering the recording and the slides and all the rest of it, so people can follow it up.
Yep, you're welcome.